Okay, so we're rolling whenever you want, Sonia.
So you said you have a pencil that I could use?
In the spring, because Princeton has acid soil, in the spring you get a lot of azaleas and rhododendron because they like acid soil, and so by the graduate school, a whole block of rhododendron. You look down, you're going to a lane, a valley of rhododendron on either side. It's gorgeous.
Okay.
So let's go, huh?
Anytime, yep.
Okay. Let's see. So we'll start. Good morning. This is Sonia Prescott. I am here with Dr. Geddes Hanson, and we are from the Presbyterian Historical Society. We are here doing an oral history interview on November 26, 2019. All right. So we'll just get started with, as David mentioned, you're from the beginning. We'll start with were you raised in the Presbyterian Church?
Oh, heavens, no.
Okay.
No. I'm West Indian by background. My father was from St. Elizabeth's Parish in Jamaica, which had been missionized by priests, Anglican priests, who were in the Oxford movement, which was very, very high. Papa went to his grave convinced that the Pope was low church, you see, very, very high Anglican on Sunday mornings. When he was not working, he used to take me to St. Philip's in Harlem, which at that time was the largest congregation in the whole worldwide Anglican communion, all black. My mother was a Moravian. She was educated in a Moravian mission school in Antigua. A woman by the name of Rebecca had brought her child to the Roman Catholic priest in Antigua to be baptized. And the priest wouldn't baptize the child because it was of a mixed marriage. And she said, well, the hell with you. And she went out and she formed a Moravian congregation. It's the first African-American. It's the first, African-American, and since the Caribbeans are Americans, the first African-American religious institution in this hemisphere. Mama was very proud of that. When these two people met, improbable, they were so different. Papa was the elevator operator, and Mama was a maid in one of these two-story apartments you find on Central Park West. Mm-hmm. And so the elevator operator and the live-in maid got married. Very romantic. Mm-hmm. Honey, I'm supposed to be talking. My wife is sitting behind you, so you're going like this as if you're talking too much.
Your time is free.
Yeah. When Mama and Papa moved to the Bronx, the only clergy that they trusted in the Bronx was the new pastor, a kid, who was putting together this Presbyterian congregation called St. Augustine. So that's how I got involved there. St. Aug always had field education students from Union Seminary. And so I was exposed to African American Presbyterian seminarians from the time I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And 7 of us went into the ministry out of that congregation. Sort of a feeder congregation. I don't know what else you want me to say about myself. I wanted to come to Princeton. I think it was called the Candidates Committee in those days. It was the committee that was involved. It's now called the Committee on the Preparation for Ministry. It gives you some idea. I went to the Candidates Committee and told them that I offered for ministry, and I thought that Princeton would be a reasonable place for me to go to seminary because it was close. Mm-hmm. And one of the trustees of Princeton Seminary told me, oh, no, I wouldn't go to Princeton, I wouldn't fit in there, that the denomination had other seminaries for people like me. Well, I've always known who people like me were. He mentioned Lincoln and Johnson C. Smith. I found him in my up yours box, and George Buttrick, who had been pastor of Madison Avenue Church in New York City, had recently gone to Harvard to be the preacher at the chapel at Memorial Chapel there, and I knew Reverend George because when I was a kid in high school Presbyterian stuff, we used to meet from time to time at Madison Avenue when he was pastor. So he at least seen me, mm-hmm. And and because he had gone to Harvard, Harvard was acceptable, mm-hmm. to the Candidates Committee, and that was the time when Douglas Horton was trying to build up the divinity school at Harvard. It was there were 58 of us in my incoming class, and we outnumbered everybody else in the seminary put together. But George, we used to call him the Green Dean because he got there when we got there. And at Harvard, the faculty had no bones about what was going on. We were told, quite frankly, look, we'll give you the best theological education you can get this side of the pond. If you want to waste it by going into serving a congregation, well, that's your problem. You pay the tuition. And so far as I know, only 2 of us out of my class of 50, incoming class of 58, 28 of us graduated. Out of that graduating class of 28, I know of only one other fellow who voluntarily went into congregational ministry. Many of the others served congregations, but that was to get tuition money for their doctorates. I had always wanted. I had never wanted to be a scholar. I never wanted to be a faculty person. I was interested. So I went to the school. It didn't do me a heck of a lot of good because it taught me nothing about being a pastor. I had to learn that. A fellow by the name of Bob Davidson, who became a moderator of the General Assembly. Pastor Davidson was pastor of the Soundview Presbyterian Church. Soundview is a geographic description. It's on Soundview Boulevard. It's not a theological claim. Okay. Went to Soundview, and I did work there for a summer. Then when I graduated from the divinity school, I worked there as an assistant well, we got married. We got married in 59. We got married in 59. So I must have I graduated in 58. So we got married about a year after that. What else is there?
What was your experience like when you started at the first congregation that you served at? We had it as Reeve Memorial. What was that experience like there?
Oh, yeah, well, Soundview, may I go back to
Sure.
Soundview was an interesting congregation.
Okay.
It was white, black, and Hispanophone. And it had 3 clergy. On Epiphany, three King's Day, we used to get all dressed up for these for the Spanish language service and process as the 3 kings coming in. I got told by Blind George, who was a sort of a eminence grise in Black Presbyterianism at that time. Blind George was in charge of everything behind the scenes. You heard of what had happened because Brian had become involved, but you never saw Brian. He worked for the Ford Foundation. He told me that there was this little church in Philadelphia that was in such bad shape. There was a great congregation for a young fellow because anything you did had to be up. And he said, knowing me as he did, he said it had a wonderful little pipe organ. So, and it had a station that played jazz 24 hours a day. So I knew that God was calling me to that particular congregation. I went there, and I stayed 4.5 years there. And I talk about my time with that people. And that's when I learned to be a pastor. They taught me how to be a pastor. And it was my time with that congregation that, as I say, taught me how to be a pastor. They were wonderful. They knew that I didn't know from Bullfoot, as my mother would say. And so they tolerated the kid and helped him along. They and the local undertaker, who always wore a swallowtail coat and striped pants. You know, the very formal Mr. Terry. So anyhow, I got there, and I think in the course of the 4.5 years I was there, we something like doubled or tripled that budget and doubled the membership. Young Black professionals were just moving into that part of Philadelphia. And somebody said, you know, you're a relatively literate kid down there, corner 50th and Aspen Streets. And so I got a lot of sermon tasters. And some of them stuck. There was a group of women in the congregation, the Gibson sisters. Was that the name? Okay, the Gibson sisters. They started to invite their friends, and so we began to build up a congregation. It wasn't my fault at all. That congregation did it. I mean, those young women did it. We had no youth group because everybody in the congregation was past that age. But the World's Fair was starting in New York at about that time. And we did have about 2 or 3 kids. And they got together under the leadership of my wife and Rudy Fleith. Rudy was the Boy Scout executive for that part of the country and Europe. They were a formidable team. Some kids started coming, and these kids made a deal with the World's Fair. You know, you could buy advance tickets. So they bought up a batch of advance tickets, and they sold tickets to the World's Fair and round-trip bus rides from the church, and they had gotten the advance tickets at a reduced price, so they were making money on. This deal. Thing is that each bus held about 50 people, and they insisted on selling 51 seats, and so we'd have to get another bus.
Right.
We ended up with 3 buses because these kids wouldn't stop selling tickets. Youth Sunday, the year after that, they decided they're going to take over the 11 o'clock service, the only service. And they were going to be responsible for the speaker, the choir, everything. And they got the guy who did the youth work for the Presbyterian to be the preacher. And they were going to be the choir. We had a young choir master who taught them Jesu joy of man's desiring. Oh gosh. If I hear that song one more time, I'm going to puke. They started coming into the congregation, a recessional, a processional order. It just kept coming. They overflowed the choir loft. They had set seats. One of the elders turned around, he looked at me and said, Pastor, where all those little niggas come from? Kids used to, we were at 50th and Aspen. Now Aspen, I don't know if you know fully, but Aspen does not run parallel to Market Street, the way most streets. It runs catty-cornered. And it's about 4 blocks north of Market on 50th Street, you know. And so we had kids coming from 30th Street. I don't know how they heard about this. They had kids coming. We were inundated with kids. It got dark, and by the time we got out of, the Sunday afternoon youth group meeting, men in the congregation used to come by, drive the kids back home across 30th Street, because we were afraid that if they had to make it by themselves through the dark, it wouldn't be a good idea. So men in the congregation, there was a group of guys who used to hang out at the grocery store, bodega. If it was Spanish, it would be bodega. And they used to hang out there. And it used to intimidate some of the senior high girls, And they would sort of linger around after the meeting because they didn't want to pass through that gauntlet. My wife, why? She said, "What the heck? Get out of here! I want to go home." And they told me, Miss Hanson, blah blah blah, guys at the corner. And that one went out, and she fronted these guys on the corner. I'm scared stiff. I can't fight 6 or 7 guys. And she fronted them, and she said, "Look, my girls want to go home. You're giving them a hard time. I don't want to hear that. You do that again, I'm going to call the cops." Now, we got hot chocolate and donuts inside. You want to meet the girls inside? Go ahead. And so she busted that up. We had a good time. When I got to that congregation, it had a stone face. The front of the building was stone, the rest of the building was brick. It hadn't been pointed in so long. You have to point that stuff. It hadn't been pointed in so long that when I stood in the pulpit, I could see the outline of each of those stones because the water had worked its way through. So we spent a good, and it was over the sewer line, ran right underneath the basement. We kept getting water. No, it wasn't sewer, it was Mill Creek. Used to run underneath, and high tea, aquifer, and sometimes the basement would get water. So I spent I spent 4.5 years. We literally rebuilt that building. We repointed the outside, and then the men in the congregation. I found out what young pastors need to learn. One of the things that young pastors could learn: you never ask anybody to do anything. You ask people, groups, to do things. I approached one of the young men in the congregation, and I pointed that out. I said, what a possibility of you and some of your buddies giving us a hand, coming in and giving us a paint job. They said, okay. And it took about 6 or 7 months. But he got to get, and half the guys were not members of the congregation then, but they became members of the congregation halfway through the paint job. We put in a new floor in the basement and new restrooms and a new kitchen, you know. We rebuilt that place, and then you can spot pulpit nominating committees. I mean, they stand out like sore thumbs. And it was this particular group was from the Witherspoon United Congregation in Indianapolis. Well, I'm from the Bronx. I mean, you know. Anything between the Hudson River and the Sierra Nevada exists to be flown over. But I went. It was the money. We were a young couple, and I realized that we would never be able to afford to send a kid to college if I stayed in that congregation.
Go on, so, yeah.
There was not the money. And so we went out to Indianapolis, where I stayed for 2 years, 2 months, 9 days, and 11 hours. These were fine people, but they weren't my people. It was a silk stocking congregation. I mean, these people had money. At the early service in the morning, my wife was the only woman in there who didn't have a fur coat on in the winter. There was one bookstore. It sold books for Butler University. What am I going to do in a town that's got one bookstore? And so now there's no bookstore, so what the hell? Yeah, 2 years, 2 months, 9 days, and 11 hours. Because I had field education students from Princeton when I was in Philadelphia. And because I was one of a cadre of about a half a dozen or so inner city pastors who had developed a program for Princeton called Teaching Church. At that time, the church was ostensibly very concerned about inner city ministry. They said, no, none of our students go into it because they're from the suburbs and the country. They don't know what the hell's going on. Can you do something to introduce them to? So we put together a two-day program. Students would come to the seminary, would come to one of the congregations of about 5 or so of us in the inner city areas of Philadelphia at the time. And on Saturday morning, we would have a cram course in urban ecclesiology. stewardship in inner city congregation, where, at that stage of the game, when poor people, pledges really don't make a whole lot of sense. Stewardship, evangelism, relations with other people serving entities in the community. So we had from the local police precinct and from the charge nurse in one of the shifts in the emergency room. Just introducing them to the lives that inner city people live. And they got to us on Saturday morning. They spent 3 hours in a seminar. They scattered for lunch in congregations where they were assigned. They worked Saturday afternoon, slept over. Somehow it was the congregation's responsibility to find a place for them to lay their heads. And then on Sunday, they served the congregation the way field education students generally do, teaching Sunday school, taking part in worship. And then on Sunday evening, they'd go home. It turned out that our student was the guy who had the car. So on Sunday evening, they would all find their way to our manse to be driven back. And Carrie would make, she likes to make cakes, breads, so they would sit in our living room waiting to be debriefed. And then they would drive back to Princeton. I went out to Indianapolis and Princeton, on the basis of work I had done with the field education people, Princeton called and offered me the possibility of coming back and being an assistant in the Office of Field Education. And I said, okay. And I met with the dean and the president. And I said that I always felt that I hadn't quite finished. I still had a degree in me. And I wanted to work on my doctorate. And the dean said, okay, or the president, James McCord, Jazai, said, you can, okay, you can work part-time, you can work for the dean, and then you can work on your doctorate. And I said, no, I'll work on my doctorate and work for the dean part-time. I want to know where my priorities are. I don't want you to know where my priorities are. And so I did it, and it took me, because I was working, it took me about a year or more than it should have. It took me about a year more than it should have. But I was in a place called the Office of Professional Studies. The fellow up the road, Jim Armstrong, who knows more about Princeton Seminary than anybody else on the face of the earth. He left McAllister College, came to Princeton Seminary. Now Jim is 90-some years old. He's about 90. He came to Princeton Seminary, and he never left. He came to Princeton. He came to the university, and then to the seminary. It's the only place he's ever got a paycheck from. And he's very shy. So he approached me one day and he said, look, why don't you leave? Why don't you come work for me? See, because he was in the office as sort of like dean of students, but not the, no, that's not the job for him. He said what he wanted was somebody to buffer between him and the students. He said, with Dean Adams, you're going to have to work from 8:30 to 4:30. Those are the school hours. I don't care when you work, as long as you get the job done. And you'll have more freedom to write your thesis. And so that's what I did. Took me about a year longer doing it that way than it would have taken, but I knew every student on their campus, especially funerals. You know, one time I'd say, look, you have a pastor. This is bad. I can't be doing this. And even now, you know, I guess within the last 3 weeks, I got a phone call from somebody who had been a kid in that congregation whose parents would die wanted me to do a funeral. I said, you've got a pastor, for God's sake. Students, I get involved in telling stories about our serving, and it has to be in the plural, about us serving that congregation. And students will say, oh, Doc, why did you leave? And it was the money. We were not going to be able to send it. And in those days, you know, there were not as many opportunities for free. Well, anyhow. We had her, which got her in trouble, almost got her in trouble. Our kids were senior highs, and they would go to the council at West Philadelphia High School, and it was sending them off to places in the historic black colleges in Europe, in the South, mostly in the South, which meant that their parents would not be able to see them. They couldn't have afforded to come home for Thanksgiving. You know, it was just awkward. It would have been bad. And top of that, when they came back to Philly, if they wanted to teach in Pennsylvania, as many of them did want to be schooled, you have to have a year of schooling in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, to be able to teach in. So this one marched into the counselor's office at West Philadelphia High School and told the counselor, look, here's a list of my kids. I don't want you talking to my kids. I'll take care of my kids. I'll get them all into college. Don't talk to my kids. When we met, she was playing semi-pro basketball, and she was the dirtiest player on the court. And somehow, she can communicate that without saying that. Well, they left our kids alone. She got every one of those kids into college. Except one who didn't particularly want to go to college. And she ended up running the hotel in Philadelphia. You know, if I had known about her when we got married, we wouldn't have, I'd have been too scared. At any rate, came here, she was in, Princeton has this, well, in those days had this 2-week program in the summer called the Institute of Theology. And well, my mother came to visit us one spring. We thought she'd never leave. Mama was a nice lady, but too much Antiguaness, too much. So we took advantage of the fact that they were having that Institute of Theology, and that because I was working myself into a nervous breakdown, the president's assistant who knew me managed to connive to get a fellowship for me there, so I wouldn't have to pay. It was a way of getting me out to recoup. So we came east, and Carrie went to her folks in Virginia, and I went to New York. Anyhow, the president's assistant, a fellow by the name of Jim Andrews, who ended up as stated clerk of the Southern Stream of the Presbyterian Church. Jim Andrews approached me and said, you know, blah, 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 come back and you will. and we worked out this deal, no hard work. And so I called Carrie, who was in Virginia. I said, how'd you like to live in Princeton? And I told her, she said, I'm going home to pack now. When I got back to Indianapolis, there were packing boxes all over the place. Try to explain to a congregation what those packing boxes are. Our car had no air conditioning. In those days, you could get a car without air conditioning. You could get a car without windshield washers. And so we would drive at night because it was hot. And one night we bundled ourselves and our cat, Mailing, into our car, and we drove east. And I started to go to school again, which was fine. I have fun in school. I went to Stuyvesant High School, which is considered, it's a public school, but it sends more of its graduates on to PhD than any other secondary school in the country, private or public. And it's a matter of what you're prepared for. I don't know whether I'm giving you what you want, but these are things that are important to me. My mother used to do days work. You know what days work is? You're a servant, a domestic servant, but you don't live in. There was a place called the Jennings Street slave market, where African American women used to congregate on the corners, the way you see Hispanophone men congregate on corners here in Princeton, waiting for somebody to pick them up and take them home to work. And on this day, Mama didn't get picked up to go to work. They say that Mama was too pretty, that these women didn't want her in their homes. So, could be. She was a beautiful woman. So she went to visit the school where my sister was. Avis was 11 years older than I. And she heard my sister's voice down the hall. She went down the hall, and she said, my sister was basically teaching the class. The teacher, when Mama found her, was in the teacher's lounge smoking. They just said, these two West Indian parents just said, that was not going to do. So that next weekend, they got on the trolley cars, and they rode around till they found an area where the signs were in Yiddish on the storefronts. And they got off, and they started walking around, looking in the basement windows for help wanted signs. And on Jennings Street, there was a sign in the window that said, janitor wanted. Respectable Negroes may apply. I understand that my sister asked my father whether we were respectable peoples, whether we were respectable black, and he said, no, we are respectable people. Well, anyhow, they got the job. See, now because that was a Jewish neighborhood, Avis and I got to go to schools. You see, kids get the kind of education that parents demand. And these parents in that neighborhood demanded that their kids get the kind of education that was going to get them into college. So Avis went to Hunter High, and then Hunter College, and I went to Stuyvesant, and then to Howard. But that was because we were prepared to do so. because of where we went to school. And a lot of our societal problems, I think, are a function of people not being prepared to do other than what they do, which is nothing. Anyhow.
Do you feel like your experience at, say, Howard and then later at Harvard helped prepare you for the kind of challenges and things you met when you ended up at Princeton?
Yeah, Howard gave me a wonderful education. Mm-hmm. I had no trouble with Harvard's curriculum because of the preparation I got at Howard. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of what you're prepared to do. Mm-hmm. No, Howard was not a problem. It was more of a culture shock than anything else. That was only replicated when I went to serve the Silk Stocking congregation in Indianapolis. But that was Howard in those days was a relatively different school than it is now. It was a place where black parents could afford it, sent their daughters to keep them safe. I don't know what I did, but when I was at Stuyvesant, I remember a teacher coming by and dropping something on my desk and said, "Fill that out, get back to me in the afternoon." Yes, sir. So I filled it out. And it turned out that the Pepsi Cola company paid room, board, tuition, books, and gave me a little bit of walking around money. Those Pepsi Cola scholarships were fantastic. I had been admitted to Columbia, but my sister was anxious that I get out of town because she was afraid she was afraid I would die if I had to spend I would be killed if I spent another 4 years there. And she was probably right. So I went down to Howard, which was that was the first real culture shock of my life. The second one being when I went to Indianapolis.
Was there a culture shock when you first started working for Princeton, being on the other side, working as faculty there? Or you had already gotten used to the Princeton culture by that point?
You know the term people get described as your mentor? Mm-hmm. When Ulysses, in the Odyssey, when Ulysses was going off on his travels, mm-hmm. he left his wife and son and household under the care of his friend called Mentor. That's where it comes from. Well, Mentor did a horrible job, but the title stuck. Dean Adams, the fellow who was Dean of Field Education, was my mentor in the literature. I'm sure that I said things to people and did things at Princeton mm-hmm. when I first got here that would have got me thrown out of this place. Oh yeah, when I think of the way I talk to some of the people around here, I think the fact that I had been a pastor, and I suspected I was a pretty good one, and I knew I could get a job if I left the seminary. See, a lot of doctoral candidates stay in programs because they don't know what they're going to do if they aren't in that program. That was not a problem for me. And so I'm sure that I'm sure that Dean Adams buffered for me more times than I know. Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost track.
Well, sure. No, that's fine. I was just, wanting to learn more about your experiences on the faculty. And then, I know at this point, in 1971, Edler Hawkins was also at Princeton's faculty. What was your experience like working with him?
Oh, well, you see, he'd been my pastor. And Rev was very sick. He was one of the presidents of the World Council of Churches. He ran their program to combat racism. He was forever flying to Geneva. They said they'd take him to the airport, and he would buy an economy ticket, put him on a Swiss Air flight, and the flight crews knew him well enough to move him into the business section. Yeah. So, So I had the honor of working, being able to call him my colleague for a number of years before he died, and that was a high point of my. I think that was a high point of my experience with Princeton before I came back from Indianapolis. That I could call Rev my colleague. He lived in that A-frame house that you had to pass to come into the circle, and which you'll have to pass going back out. And every year, he would send out hundreds and hundreds of Christmas cards. There was an artist in the congregation who every year designed a Christmas card for Rev to send. And he had this wide array of friends and contacts all over the world. And it just one Sunday morning in Advent, he was signing Christmas cards. And he had a heart attack. His daughter was living with them, called me and said, Geddes, you gotta get down to the hospital. They took he had a heart attack. And while I was there waiting with Thelma, his wife, this little bitty Asian doctor came out and told us that Rev had died. And I promised myself that if somebody had to tell Carrie that I had died, I wanted it to be that guy. And so when we came to Princeton, we made it so that he was our GP. And he's just retired. We're breaking in this new guy. Yeah. Again, I'm lost.
Dr. Hanson, if you want to pause and regroup, that's fine.
No, I'm lost. Please ask me a question.
Okay. So I guess my next question was just going to be, it seems like the role of mentor is an important role for you. What has your experience been like mentoring students? Playing.
Oh, I have been so fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
The dean of the chapel at Duke Powery. one day was a knock on the door, and it was Luke and his wife, and they came in and said, Duke has called me to be chap. I didn't apply for the job. They had snuck in, they had heard him preach, and they decided, okay. Jonathan Walton, whose kids call her Gigi, that's a gorgeous grandma, is now, became preacher at Memorial Church. That's the title, preacher at Memorial Church, and Plummer Professor of Christian Morals. He's now dean of the seminary at Wake Forest. And other graduates who've gone, they've all done so well. So well. I wouldn't know where to begin, so I won't. But they've all done so well. Kenyatta Gilbert at Howard teaches preaching. My cup runneth over. It's been that good. I couldn't have asked for anything different. If I had, it wouldn't have been this good, so what the hell?
Well, I will mention that I did an oral history interview with Minister Bertram Johnson.
Oh, yes.
And he mentioned the profound impact you all have had on him.
Yeah, Bert is the boy. His counterpart, the girl, is Dr. Raquel St. Clair Letzum. And she used to house sit for us when we had the cats. The house could stand alone, but somebody's got to be in that bed for the cats to sleep with, you see, or you know, they would have gotten very upset. And Bert always used to complain about, how come the girl always gets to sit in the house? But yeah, when's the last time we saw Bert, Carrie? It was just the other day, wasn't it?
No, we saw him on TV when Raquel was preaching at Madison Avenue.
No, at
Riverside.
Riverside, yeah. Bert's been a joy. Bert and his husband, Jason, they got married at Riverside Church. And my God, it couldn't have been that long ago.
I think it was in
May.
In May, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, he's been. It's been. Come here. Come here. Oh heavens, he's got that thing. But I want to show you a door to our basement where the pictures are.
Should pause. Okay, and so go on ahead.
All right, so
When African American students began to come in significant numbers to the seminary, the fact that the denomination had contributed to Angela Davis stood me in good stead, because you know, the thing for them was, you can't be both black and Presbyterian. I mean, you know, black folks ain't Presbyterians.
mm-hmm.
And I said that. You folks are from Barbados. You see, it's common for people from the islands to be other than Baptist or Methodist or independent. I mean, you know, that's a commonality. But American blacks, people whose tradition is in the South before the Great Migration, tend to be Baptist And so we always have to be, yeah, I'm a Presbyterian, but I'm black too. What? And where I come, say where my folks came from, it would be odd for you not to be an Anglican. So,
So we talked a little bit about the Association of Black Seminarians and
I think I wrote you a note that I was too busy to be involved in the creation of what? I was a member of the faculty and administration at the time. I was West Indian at the time. And I really didn't have time to be involved in anything other than keeping my head above water academically and not putting the whole responsibility for maintaining the Hanson household on Carrie. And so I really was tangential to that. The McGuinn brothers were the fellows who really put that together. And Bill Howard, who became, I don't even know if Bill is still alive. He was pastor of the Bethany congregation in Newark. My mother used to say that it was unnatural for a parent to bury their child. And I've lived long enough that I am burying, or have found out that so many of my students have been buried. That's unnatural. But
so one of the things that we definitely wanted to ask about was what was the climate like at that time when the Association of Black Seminarians was there? What were they addressing? What problems were they trying to address on campus and elsewhere?
the curriculum,
Okay.
it was called blackenizing the curriculum, more sensitivity on the part of faculty to it's possible, if you want to read American history without including blacks. Difficult, but possible, if you want to. You don't have to talk about blacks at all if you're talking about Protestant theology. You see, and our faculty was doing what came naturally. Our history, the historians did not teach anything about blacks in American church history because they didn't know anything. They were ready at many points to admit that they didn't know anything, and it never occurred to them that was important. They were Americans, as I would continually tell African American students who complain about their white colleagues, damn it, they're Americans. The fact that they've offered for ministry, come to seminary, does not mean that they are no longer Americans, and you know how they are. So, yeah, that was, and because I was Presbyterian, because I was West Indian in background, because I was part of the administration. In fact, the question whether or not I was black was alive when in the minds of many students. Okay, I live with that. And so, well, we, yeah, it was a live one in the Minds Ministers, and that was okay, because, you know, I really didn't have the time or the energy to get involved with it. And by disposition, I don't get involved. Not because I'm just reclusive. I had to learn. But that's a nice way of saying I'm a loner. I was thinking the other day about what that meant, and I had to. I can think of three. I can think of. In my generation, I can think of maybe 4 men that I'm privileged to call my friends. When Coffee Froelich, who the seminary acquired, who Princeton Seminary acquired, when Drew Seminary went underwater, some of that faculty came to be the faculty of Princeton. One of those, a fellow by the name of Coffee Froelich, the German guy, and somebody said to his young son one day, trying to identify something, he said, well, you know, your friend so-and-so. And Froelich's kid said, ist nicht meine Freund, ist meine Bekannte. He's not my friend, he's my acquaintance. I have a lot of acquaintances. When I was growing up, the only people outside of one family lived up the block. The only people I remember my family being involved with, the only people I remember my family being involved with were other West Indians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And my father, when he wasn't working on a Sunday, he used to take me to take me to St. Philip's, the largest congregation in the Anglican community, and it was all black. So anyhow.
So I guess one other thing we wanted to ask was if there was some words of advice or some words of wisdom that you would pass on to the next generation of African American ministers or people who, you know, are going into pastoral work. What would you have to say? I know that's hard to sum up, but
Don't ghettoize yourself. Be attentive to the fact that you are an African American, that the congregations you're serving are congregations that are made up of people who have a particular history in this country. It's not the same history. Be aware of that. Be sensitive to that. But remember also that there's no virtue in ghettoizing yourself. If only because when I would go to the Black Ministers Association meetings in Philadelphia, like, they always like to see me because I could tap into white folks' money we want to do this, we want to do that. And I could. So that's a sort of a mentality. But don't ghettoize yourself, and but don't forget that your history is the history of a people who have demonstrated the kind of strength in our society that no other community has demonstrated. Shy of the Native Americans, we're different. If we want to be sensitive to, we're very different. And we need to gather strength from the fact that our people are demonstrably not only survivors, but creators and innovators and transcenders, and that, as I say, demonstrably, our folks have done stuff that communities have a right to be proud of having done. And we need to be aware of that and gain our own personal strength from that. That I'm part of a tradition in this country that has made bricks without a straw.
Do you have any additional questions?
I don't.
No?
Dr. Hanson, that was superb. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for making me think of things that I've not thought of. Yeah. Now, I'm going to be, thanks to you all, I'm going to be awake all night tonight, thinking of things that I had not thought of, thinking of things I should have said, because that's always the case. Yeah. But yeah, thank you for this. It's your initial letter asked me, made it necessary for me to frame things, to articulate things to myself that I had not previously. Is that what's going on? And that was good. That is good. The unexamined life, as I say, it's not worth living.